We know that a federal election is coming our way. We don't know when yet, but it's coming our way this year and sooner than you think. And a lot of people are basically pointing out that they think it's going to be about electricity bills, housing, cost of living, very likely to be the dominant voting choices that people are making this cycle. But of course, climate change and the environment are huge issues that won't go away. What is the best way to influence politicians and government policy? The best way to actually make a difference when it comes to nature conservation? RMIT researchers have taken a bit of a closer look at that, and believe it or not, social media and petitions do still have some sway. Professor Sarah Bekessy leads RMIT's Icon Science Research Group, also a lead counsellor with the Biodiversity Council. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick.
Why did you want to dive into how to influence environmental policy?
Well, honestly, I think we all want to be part of the solution to the biodiversity extinction crisis and climate change. And, one way that we can be part of the solution is by influencing, how governments spend money and how politicians prioritise and act for nature. You probably saw over the weekend that the federal government has decided to back down on some major promises for nature, including putting an Environmental Protection Agency into action and revisiting our laws. So, I think we probably, even and that is despite the fact that we know that most Australians care deeply about nature and want to have more money spent on nature and want to have more action on the biodiversity extinction crisis. So there's a disconnect there, and we were really keen to understand what role we could all play in closing that disconnect.
When you went to find out what sort of impact people are experiencing from these campaigns, who were you speaking to?
Oh, such an interesting group of people who we identified as having been change makers in their careers. So some were ex-politicians, some public servants, some people who worked for non-government organisations or community groups, but all people who had actually made change happen in some way, shape or form. And
what were they saying?
Oh, so fascinating. I think the number one thing is that they all said, you don't see change happen fast, but it does happen. So to remain optimistic, which I think is something that we all need to hear, you can make change happen. And actually, really interestingly, some of the government people we spoke to and public servants really, I suppose, pointed out that we don't understand how powerful our voices can be if you can actually be bothered standing up and talking and speaking out for the environment. But they also kind of identified a bunch of, strategic things that we could all be thinking about if you decide that you would like to make change happen.
I'm just going to say I was really surprised to hear that social media still had such a major impact when it feels so fractured at the moment. As someone who's spent maybe too much of his own time online over the years, this feels like a period where maybe people, I thought, weren't paying as much attention to social media.
Maybe in part it's about also building a network, even if it's an online network, because that was something that, all of our interviewers identified, that you can't make change happen by yourself. You really do need to band together with like-minded individuals, and so maybe that's part of it is creating a network. Another thing that was mentioned is, really you can't expect just one interview or one paper that you write or something to really be the thing that makes a difference. Often you've got to be there, for the long haul, making repeated messages and repeatedly communicating the ideas or speaking to politicians. So it doesn't happen overnight. It will happen,
Thank you. Well, we were talking about jingles earlier. Good reminder of that one. I was interested to know, often you can take a very broad view when you're trying to influence change when you talk about the environment. Sometimes we see people take a very targeted view as well, like I'm concerned about this area, this one particular concern for me is what I want to highlight. Does one or the other be more effective?
It really depends on the situation. So obviously you've got to be really strategic. You've got to know who to target, who needs to be influenced to make the change. You've got to know when the right time is to try and advocate. It might be that a particular policy is actually being reviewed, in which case that's a good time to talk about it. It might be that there's a budget cycle that could be influenced. Or it might even be that something's happened. So, the bushfires, when they hit Victoria for that terrible black summer, a lot of people were obviously really concerned about climate change, but people were also really cared about the impact it had on biodiversity. And so it was a time when people were sympathetic to having more government funding towards biodiversity and to thinking more carefully about how we protect the environment.
I'm talking to Professor Sarah Bekessy. She's with the RMIT's Icon Science Research Group. We're talking about the way you can influence, I guess, politicians and other policy makers. I go back to when I was younger, Sarah, and I think one of the big campaigns still stuck in my head was the damming of the Franklin River back in the 80s. In a world before social media, it seemed like a remarkably effective campaign. Would an effort like that work today?
Look, I think... I think there's probably not one model. That was one thing that all of our interviewees said. There's not one model of success that you can repeat. So maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't, but certainly there are ingredients to success that we can all think about. And I do think that take-home message that change can happen, but to remain optimistic, and that all of our interviewees said that we are more powerful than we think when we join forces, when we're a bit strategic, and we are able to be in it for the long haul.
The long haul is the hard one at the moment when we're being told that the clock is ticking.
Yeah, absolutely. Action is needed, and it's needed now. So it can be really frustrating, I think, to see that change does take so long to happen. And the other thing is that you're often up against lobby groups who have limitless resources, it seems, to advocate in the opposite direction. I mean, take the EPA at the moment. I think it's absolutely clear that the Western Australian mining companies, who were delighted about the EPA being dropped from the agenda, have been lobbying really hard and for a very long time to make sure that these kinds of changes don't happen. So, you're up against it if you're a small community group trying to make change happen at times.
Sarah, when we're talking about issues like, I guess, species extinction, this broad scheme conservation, at the same time that we're talking about families at risk of homelessness or not being able to put food on the table, do we know that this is still something people take to an election?
Well, absolutely, we do know it. I can tell you that hand on heart, because we are part of an organisation called the Biodiversity Council, and every year we survey 4,000 Australians from across demographic regions and across Australia to find out how much people do care about nature. And this year, as with other years, the vast majority of people, like 97% of Australians, want more action for nature. There's probably not an issue like it. More than 75% of people would love to see more money in the federal budget for nature. So we do know that people really care. It may not be their number one ticket item when it comes to voting, but it would be a popular option if politicians actually decided to take this issue seriously.
So it is something we will take to the election. Sarah, thank you very much. Professor Sarah Bekessy, talking about, I guess, how we go about influencing politicians, influencing change makers, even outside of an election period. It's all on the back of some research being done by RMIT's Icon Science Group. Sarah, of course, part of that, and also lead counsellor with the Biodiversity Council.